And welcome to the Communication Theory Doctor. And in this video, I'm going to cover communication privacy management theory. Now, this is a theory proposed by Sandra Petronio in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And what Sandra Petronio wanted to do with this theory was to provide a way for people to navigate privacy regarding their personal information. So many communication theories are related to self-disclosure, how people disclose information and how they make decisions about what information to disclose. Whereas Sandra Petronio's theory has to do with privacy, how people make decisions to keep their information private and what rules they follow when communicating that kind of information, etc. So it really has 5 core principles. There are 5 core principles to communication privacy management theory. And the first one is that people believe that they own and therefore control their private information. And so let's take the example of someone who shares very intimate details about their life on Facebook or on some other social media site. Some may look at that and say, well, I would never share that kind of information on a public internet site. What is that person doing? Well, that's a difference in the control decision that someone has made with their information. That person decides to share it. Another person may decide to keep it private. Right? But the bottom line is people believe that they own and therefore control how they share or don't share their private information. And that brings me to the second thing, the second principle of communication privacy management theory, which is that people control their private information through the use of certain privacy rules, right? And these rules can differ. Not every person uses the same set of rules related to how they disclose personal information. There can be variables in terms of how they develop and propose these rules. And those variables can be cultural, they can be gender-based, there can be a cost-benefit analysis involved, saying, hey, look, if I share this information with this person, it may benefit me or it may work against me. For example, me personally, I'm diagnosed with ADHD, and I make it a point to share that with every one of my classes at the beginning of each semester, because I have a rule that says that when I share that information, and this is based on just anecdotal data that I found over the years, when I share that information, it is a net benefit to me and to my students, because my students see that, and the ones who are diagnosed ADHD themselves say, now I know my instructor has ADHD, so I feel so much better about the class and so much better about emailing him about these kinds of things and so forth. So I have that as a rule, and I use that partially in how I share information about my ADHD diagnosis. The third component, if you will, of communication privacy management theory is that when others are given access to the same information, they then become co-owners, or I think a better word might be co-custodians of that information. And so, in other words, when you share information with someone else, that person now has a share of the control in the information. And that's where it starts to become a little bit uncomfortable, because when you tell someone something in confidence, you are trusting that person to keep that information confidential, keep it to themselves. And yet that person is now in possession of that piece of information, and then they have the ability to share it if they want to share it. And they may have different ideas about whether that information should be shared or not. So when you make the conscious decision to share information versus keeping it private, then additional factors come into play, because now all of a sudden you've involved other parties or other people. Let me give you an example of this. Let's say that you go to the doctor, you go to a specialist, and you're diagnosed with a heart condition. And it's a severe heart condition that probably will require surgery, maybe some extended hospital stays, and things like that. And so you go back home and you decide, okay, well, I'm going to tell my spouse, my significant other, perhaps my kids if they're old enough or mature enough to handle the news, maybe my parents, or maybe two or three others closest to me. But you probably, most of us are going to keep that information to a pretty small circle. We're probably not going to share it to acquaintances or people at work or friends of friends and that kind of thing. But still, we have given other people control to a certain degree of that information. And when people share the information against our wishes, that brings into play something called boundary turbulence, which I'll talk about after I finish discussing the last of the 5 components here. So the 4th component is that co-owners of private information need to negotiate mutually agreeable privacy rules about telling others. So staying with the same illustration. So you've been diagnosed with this serious heart condition. You go home, you sit down with your spouse, your significant other, your children, your parents, whoever it is, and you sit them down and you say, here's the diagnosis, here's what the prognosis is as far as short-term and long-term. I'm telling you this because you are the people closest to me. You're going to be the one walking with me through this. And so I feel you need to know this for our collective benefit. However, I ask that you not say anything about it to those outside of our immediate family, because I don't know that I'm ready to share it publicly yet. And then maybe your mother or someone else says, well, would you mind if I shared it with my pastor so that he can pray for you and that he can pray for the family? And I might say yes or no, but that's the negotiating those privacy rules, who you can share it with, who you can't, what are the circumstances, and those kinds of things. And then finally, when co-owners of private information don't effectively negotiate and follow those protocols, then you get what's called relational turbulence. And relational turbulence is, boundary turbulence, I should say, is a major problem because it involves expectancy violations. You have negotiated these rules, people have agreed on them, and then all of a sudden, let's say you're at the store a few days later and you meet up with somebody who's an acquaintance, is a friend of a friend, and they come up to you and they say, how are you doing? I was so devastated to learn about your diagnosis. And you say to yourself, wait a minute, somebody has told this confidence. Somebody has not held my information in private as I asked them to, because this person wouldn't know that otherwise. And so all of a sudden now there's boundary turbulence because someone has violated your boundaries that you negotiated with them. And so boundary turbulence can be very destructive to long-term relationships and relationships with those closest to us. So again, there are 5 areas or 5 principles of communication privacy management theory. And if the principles are not followed and if privacy is violated, then boundary turbulence can result. This is the Communication Theory Doctor. That's the theory.